If your PCOS diet isn't working, it's probably because you're treating the wrong phenotype. 70% of women are following diets that don't match their metabolic needs, and I am about to show you the solution. Hi, I'm Kara McIver, a registered dietitian that educates young and middle-aged adults on evidence-based, easy-to-accomplish strategies to manage and prevent the risk of chronic diseases. I mostly focus on conditions related to insulin resistance, and today I'm going to be talking about PCOS. If you have PCOS and you don't have the time or money to see a registered dietitian, this is the channel for you. Now, I want to be transparent here. I do not have PCOS, but insulin-related conditions are why I became a registered dietitian, and I actually studied another estrogen-related chronic condition called lipedema for my master's thesis project. So I hope that you can believe me when I say I care about you and I understand a little bit about what you are going through, and I am here to help you find things that actually work. Most PCOS advice ignores differences between the different phenotypes of PCOS. For example, 92% of people with phenotype A have insulin resistance, but only about 38% of people with phenotype D have insulin resistance, and therefore the treatment plans for those folks probably should look different. Another example is that not everyone with PCOS needs to lose weight, and not everyone with PCOS is trying to get pregnant. Those treatment plans are going to be different based on the appropriate goals for the individual patients. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say phenotypes, I highly recommend you go back and you watch my first video on PCOS phenotypes and try to figure out which one you are maybe experiencing, and then come back to this video for the best nutrition advice for your phenotype. Now, first, let's talk about weight loss, because I think most people who have PCOS or suspect they have PCOS, the first recommendation they get is to lose weight. There is some research evidence to support that weight loss is appropriate for people who have PCOS and obesity. However, the recommendation for PCOS is about a 5 to 10% body weight reduction in folks who have a BMI over 30. Now, when it comes to metabolic benefits and weight loss, the recommendation tends to be somewhere between 5 and 20% of the original body weight, depending on what is necessary for you. I don't have phenotype-specific weight loss recommendations, so talk to your doctor about what might be the right number or the right goal for you. If you currently have a healthy body weight, so a BMI between 18.5 and 25, weight loss is not necessarily appropriate for you. Also, if like me, you have a BMI between 25 and 30, but you are highly muscle, then weight loss is probably not going to be the right option for you either. We want you to keep that muscle mass. Just because you have a BMI between 18.5 and 25 doesn't necessarily mean you're following the best diet and lifestyle recommendations. If you want to know more about that, you can watch my video about health at every size, which goes in depth about how behaviors, rather than a specific number, are actually what tends to be most supportive of our overall health. And if you do think that you need to lose some weight as part of your PCOS management, I highly recommend working with a registered dietitian, because folks with PCOS have been shown to have higher rates of eating disorders, which can also be really detrimental to your overall health, especially your mental health. After I go over the specific phenotype recommendations when it comes to diet, I am also going to give you one tip that I recommend for everyone with PCOS. Let's talk about phenotype A and phenotype B, which have higher risks of developing metabolic diseases, things like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Phenotype A, when you have all three characteristics of the Rotterdam criteria, tends to have the highest risk of insulin resistance. And phenotype B tends to have hidden metabolic dysfunction, but without that ovarian morphology. The guidelines that I mentioned in the intro recommend that these two phenotypes see the best results when they are following a Mediterranean diet with a sustainable caloric deficit if they are in that weight category category that would benefit from weight loss. The guidelines recommend for phenotype C, androgen-focused nutrition strategies, and for phenotype D, they recommend cycle support and general health optimization. For these two phenotypes, C and D, there tends to be lower metabolic risk, and so standard healthy eating patterns tend to be sufficient. That would be things like following the Dietary Guidelines for Americans MyPlate recommendations. Now, this might sound disappointing or like it's not enough to go off of, but I would disagree. According to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, most adults in the United States would only score a 56 or a 59 out of 100 if they were tested on following the MyPlate recommendations. So there is some room for improvement for most adults. Most adult females are not eating enough fruit, vegetables, or dairy. Younger adult females, 19 to 30, don't eat enough grains overall. Older adult females are eating enough grains, but most of their grains are refined grains, not eating enough whole grains, which is what we would recommend for people with PCOS. I know that many of us who are struggling with insulin resistance have been told to cut carbohydrates, but that is not exactly the approach that I would take. The Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, which I mentioned for phenotypes A and B especially, they do include reasonably high amounts of carbohydrates, largely fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Most females are also exceeding the recommended intake for added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. In addition to optimizing the intake of those food groups for PCOS, those food groups also tend to increase the risk of developing things like cardiovascular disease, which is the leading killer of females worldwide, including women with PCOS. So those were the general guidelines. Let's dig a little bit deeper into some specific recommendations for each phenotype. For phenotypes A and B, the Mediterranean diet with a 5 to 10% weight loss target is recommended. Now, the Mediterranean diet emphasizes plant-based foods like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, and nuts, along with healthy fats like olive oil. It also includes moderate amounts of fish, poultry, dairy, and eggs, while limiting processed foods like added sugars and red meat. So again, sounds pretty close to the general dietary guidelines for Americans as well. The Mediterranean diet also often includes red wine. For folks with PCOS, it is recommended that you skip the red wine and instead prioritize green tea for the polyphenol benefits. The international guidelines also recommend for phenotypes A and B, supplementing with 1 to 3 grams per day omega-3 fatty acids to help with inflammation reduction. They recommend for these groups protein timing around resistance exercise, and around 25 to 30% of the daily calories come from protein. And that protein doesn't necessarily have to all be meat. Again, you are going to get some protein from dairy, from some certain types of whole grains, and even from some vegetables. A low glycemic index diet might be appropriate for phenotypes A and B. Glycemic index refers to the level to which blood sugar will spike after you eat a certain food. Foods with higher fiber in them, like whole grains, tend to have a lower glycemic index because the fiber slows down the carbohydrate digestion, which in turn flattens that blood sugar curve. Phenotype C is considered moderate risk, and the nutrition recommendations really center around anti-androgenic foods, which would be things like spearmint tea. 2 cups of spearmint tea is recommended per day for phenotype C, as well as 1 to 2 tablespoons of flaxseed per day. Balanced macronutrient breakdown is recommended for this group, so we're not cutting out carbohydrates entirely. We're not doing a really low carbohydrate or a really low fat diet, but rather about 30% of your calories coming from protein. And then for balance, I typically recommend around 40% of calories coming from carbohydrates and that last 30% of calories coming from healthy fats. But personalization on what exactly that balance looks like is going to be really important for the sustainability of the diet for you. For phenotype C, they also recommend strategic carbohydrate intake intake, especially around ovulation. Ovulation is something that takes a lot of energy out of our body, and carbohydrates are the primary fuel for all of our body's tissues. And so we don't want to be really reducing carbohydrates, especially around that time in our menstrual cycle when we are ovulating. Zinc is also a really key nutrient for androgen balance. So things like pumpkin seeds and lean meats do tend to have high amounts of zinc. Phenotype D tends to be a lower metabolic risk group. And so a nutrient whole food diet without calorie restriction tends to be what's most appropriate for this group. Nutrients that support the menstrual cycle, including iron, B vitamins, and magnesium, tend to be recommended. We can get all of these nutrients through foods. Iron we can get through lean meats or some plant-based sources. B vitamins, again, we tend to get mostly from carbohydrates. B12 we specifically get from meat, and magnesium we can also get through plants, fruits, vegetables, leafy greens. Now is a good time to mention that lentils are a really good source of all three of these nutrients, so can be an important inclusion in your diet. The focus for this group should be minimal restriction and maximum sustainability. So we are not talking about doing something for 30 days, following a diet plan for 75 days, 3 months, even a year. We are really talking about building a dietary pattern that you can follow most days until you hit menopause, maybe even for the rest of your life. The international guidelines also recommend regular meal timing to support natural ovulation. So that means not doing something like fasting. We want to be eating regularly throughout the day, regularly throughout the week to support ovulation. The 2023 guidelines also remind us that there is not one superior diet for all 4 phenotypes. You may be receiving recommendations on diet that are just not appropriate for the way that your PCOS presents. Individualization trumps rigid phenotype protocols, and cultural and personal preferences are important for sustainability. For example, we can get similar nutrients from really any kind of leafy green. I really don't like kale. I much prefer spinach or collards. And so if I am trying to get those nutrients, it is going to be better for me to get them from the foods that I like rather than listening to someone who says, you gotta eat kale. Because you probably don't have to eat kale.
They could find out kale cures cancer and I would still be like, I'm just gonna do the chemo.
And you probably don't have to eat any one specific food that you don't like. The guidelines also recommend behavioral support as a crucial piece, no matter which phenotype classification you're in. And that behavioral support might come from a partner or a friend or peer support group. It might come from working with a registered dietitian, doctor, depending on your circumstances. But long-term management of a chronic disease like this just oftentimes takes support when things get complicated and life tries to get in the way. We are also reminded that there is limited evidence for phenotype-specific dietary intervention. And that is because when research studies are being done on patients with PCOS, the phenotypes are oftentimes pooled. So we don't have hard and fast guidelines for any phenotype. Rather, what we've talked about to this point is based on the best evidence that we have to this point. Because research is limited when it comes to specific phenotypes, some practitioners and some patients choose, rather than implementing a diet for a phenotype, they pick a symptom or symptoms and they aim to follow a diet that is going to be useful for those specific symptoms. I'm not going to walk through this entire chart, but let's look at 2 different symptoms and kind of walk through what we know might be some good diet and supplement choices when it comes to those symptoms. If you are experiencing hirsutism, that is a really hard word for me to say. It just means hair growth in places that is atypical for females. So if you have, excessive hair growth on your face, on your chest, tends to be in places where males more often grow hair. The recommendation for diet is calorie restriction restriction. If you are in those higher BMI categories, calorie restriction is never appropriate for someone who is already at a healthy body weight. There may be some useful supplements, however, to combat that hair growth: magnesium, zinc, calcium, vitamin D, and myo-inositol. Myo-inositol is often recommended for PCOS, and for certain symptoms it is useful, and for certain symptoms it's just not the right supplement. With a thoughtful diet that follows, the dietary guidelines for Americans or the Mediterranean dietary pattern, magnesium, zinc, and calcium, we can typically get enough of those nutrients from our diet. Vitamin D is really difficult for adults to get enough of, and so oftentimes for, several different chronic conditions, vitamin D is a useful supplement. And myo-inositol, you're going to want to get this supplement form if you think that that is going to be useful for your symptoms. When it comes to herbs, green mint and licorice smooth have been shown as useful herbs. I know that both of those are oftentimes seen in tea. Now let's look at another symptom: insulin resistance. If you are trying to treat insulin resistance specifically, a high fiber diet with reduced glycemic index would likely be appropriate to address your insulin resistance if you have PCOS, and probably even if you don't have PCOS. And again, reduced glycemic index just refers to foods that are not going to spike your blood sugar as high. And so it makes sense that those foods are going to be higher in fiber. They also recommend reduced calories for this group if weight loss is appropriate. Vitamin D and myo-inositol recommended here again for insulin resistance, as well as a berberine supplement. Berberine has been used for centuries in traditional Chinese medicine and has been shown to be beneficial for blood glucose support. When it comes to herbs, if you are treating insulin resistance, aloe vera, cinnamon, green tea, chamomile, and white mulberry might be useful for you. If you get on Google or Reddit or TikTok, there is so much information about what to eat or not eat if you have PCOS. Not only can it be confusing, it can just be inappropriate for the symptoms or the phenotype of PCOS that you are experiencing. So I hope that this video has helped you clarify, organize perhaps, and just see some of the evidence-based recommendations that match your symptoms and your goals. I would love if you dropped your phenotype in the comments and tell me your biggest dietary challenge. I may actually be able to give you some recommendations just through the comments. And please subscribe if you would like more evidence-based PCOS content that cuts through the online confusion with real research. I do have a few more videos on this topic planned, and then I also have a ton of insulin resistance related content to come as well. So if that sounds like something that would be useful to you, please subscribe to the channel. And if you are interested in learning about the connection between weight loss medications and PCOS, you might want to check out this video, which kind of walks through a little bit about what we know there. Thank you so much for being here today.